Russia's most infamous serial killers didn't come from legends or nightmares, but from ordinary streets and painfully normal apartment blocks, thriving not on genius but on weak oversight, ignored warnings, and systems that preferred paperwork over people. Andrei Romanovich, Alexander Spesivtsev, and Mikhail Popkov weren't monsters hiding in the dark, but failures hiding in plain sight, where silence was easier than intervention and indifference cheaper than action, making the real shock not how brutal they were, but how long no one seemed to notice. Because sometimes, evil doesn't need secrecy, it just needs everyone to look the other way. Andrei Romanovich. Andrei Romanovich's criminal path was rooted in a childhood defined by abuse, instability, and normalized violence, conditions that shaped his perception of human life as disposable and conflict as inevitable. Growing up in a harsh social environment, he learned early that force was a means of control rather than a moral boundary, a lesson that followed him into adulthood where emotional volatility and suppressed rage became central features of his behavior. His murders were often impulsive and intensely violent, targeting vulnerable individuals who were unlikely to be immediately missed or investigated with urgency. Romanovich did not rely on elaborate planning or clever disguises. His approach was less criminal mastermind and more, what could possibly go wrong? Which, unsurprisingly, was everything. His danger lay in unpredictability and emotional escalation, making him difficult for law enforcement to profile or connect across incidents. Investigators weren't chasing a pattern so much as trying to catch a moving tantrum with legs. The fragmented nature of his crimes, combined with under-resourced investigative systems, delayed his capture and allowed his violence to continue far longer than it should have. By the time authorities finally caught up, the case served as a grim lesson that untreated trauma, mixed with social neglect and institutional laziness, doesn't just ruin one life, it spills over and ruins many others, usually while everyone else is still insisting nothing serious is happening. Alexander Spesivtsev. Alexander Spesivtsev, later known as the Novokuznetsk monster, represents one of the most disturbing examples of prolonged domestic sadism in modern criminal history. Not because his crimes were hidden, but because they were repeatedly ignored. Operating almost entirely from his apartment, Spesivtsev lured children and teenagers into his home, where they were subjected to prolonged torture and murder in conditions so extreme that they defied comprehension. Neighbors reported screams, blood, and suspicious behavior over many years, yet authorities dismissed these warnings as domestic disputes or exaggerations, reflecting a broader institutional reluctance to intervene in private spaces. Compounding this horror was the role of Spesivtsev's mother, who was aware of his actions and, at times, actively assisted him by helping lure victims or conceal evidence. The crimes continued not due to secrecy, but because of collective failure, where social services, law enforcement, and community responsibility all collapsed simultaneously. When Spesivtsev was finally arrested, investigators uncovered evidence of repeated killings and extreme abuse, leading to his declaration of criminal insanity and confinement in a psychiatric institution. His case remains a grim reminder that indifference can be as lethal as violence itself. Mikhail Popkov. Mikhail Popkov's crimes stand apart not only for their sheer scale, but for the institutional betrayal that made them possible, as he carried out his murders while actively serving as a police officer. Known as the Angarsk Maniac, Popkov exploited his uniform, authority, and public trust to murder more than 80 women over 2 decades, proving that sometimes the biggest threat is the person holding the badge. He patrolled the streets at night, offering rides under the reassuring cover of police assistance, only to turn those moments into grim moral trials, where he interrogated victims about loyalty, behavior, and his own warped sense of virtue. His access to weapons, tools, and official credibility acted like an all-access pass, while early forensic evidence sat untouched thanks to bureaucratic inertia and an impressive reluctance to investigate one of our own. Colleagues noticed inconsistencies, but treated them like awkward small talk best avoided. Internal accountability mechanisms existed mostly in theory, possibly filed somewhere between optimism and denial. When Popkov was finally arrested in 2012 after DNA advances linked him to multiple crime scenes, the relief was quickly replaced by horror as he kept confessing to more murders, as if checking items off a very long, very disturbing list. His case revealed how authority, when left unsupervised, doesn't just enable crime, it streamlines it. In the end, the uniform that was meant to protect society became the perfect disguise, proving that trust without oversight isn't trust at all, it's an open invitation. Shared patterns. Despite differences in method, psychology, and victim selection, Andrei Romanovich, Alexander Spesivtsev, and Mikhail Popkov share striking similarities rooted in systemic failure rather than individual ingenuity. Each operated within environments marked by weak institutions, social fragmentation, and limited accountability, conditions that allowed warning signs to be dismissed rather than addressed. Complaints were ignored, missing persons were deprioritized, and investigative delays created long windows of opportunity for continued violence. In all three cases, victims largely came from marginalized or vulnerable groups, making their disappearances easier to overlook and less likely to trigger urgent action. These killers did not rely on exceptional intelligence or elaborate concealment. Instead, they benefited from systems that moved slowly, shrugged often, and asked uncomfortable questions later. Bureaucracy acted like an invisibility cloak, except it was made of paperwork and bad excuses. Warning signs weren't red flags so much as decorative suggestions. Investigations progressed at a pace best described as eventually. Responsibility bounced between departments like a hot potato no one wanted to hold. In the end, their success was less about outsmarting the system and more about operating in places where the system barely showed up to work. Psychological differences. Structural similarities. Psychologically, each killer represents a different manifestation of violence, shaped by environment and power. Andrei Romanovich embodied uncontrolled rage, fueled by trauma and emotional instability, acting impulsively as if anger were a lifestyle choice rather than an emotion. Alexander Spesivtsev illustrated how prolonged isolation, severe mental illness, and enabling relationships can slowly ferment extreme sadism, like a horror story left to overcook for years. Mikhail Popkov demonstrated the corrosive effect of unchecked authority, where a badge stopped being a safeguard and started functioning more like a free pass. Their personalities were wildly different, but the systems around them failed with impressive consistency. Oversight was optional, intervention was postponed, and accountability seemed permanently under review. Red flags didn't trigger alarms, they triggered excuses. Warning signs piled up like unread emails. Each case proved that you don't need a single grand failure for disaster, just many small ones, agreeing not to care. Without early intervention, real oversight, and consequences that actually arrive on time, personal dysfunction doesn't stay personal for long. It scales up, multiplies, and becomes everyone else's problem. Why these cases still matter today. These stories are not merely historical accounts of extreme crime, but cautionary examples of what happens when institutions choose convenience over protection and silence over responsibility. The conditions that allowed these killers to operate, public apathy, weak oversight, and the normalization of neglect, are not trapped in one country, one decade, or one bad bureaucratic mood. Wherever authority goes unquestioned and vulnerable lives are treated like low-priority emails, similar risks quietly line up. These cases matter because they expose how systems fail slowly, politely, and with impressive confidence that nothing is wrong. Warnings weren't missed. They were postponed. Responsibility wasn't denied. It was endlessly redirected. The machinery of prevention kept running, just without actually preventing anything. Understanding these crimes isn't about morbid curiosity or glorifying evil. It's about pattern recognition before the sequel happens. The most unsettling truth isn't how brutal the violence was, but how long it took anyone to interrupt it. When societies wait for certainty instead of acting on warning signs, they don't just allow disasters, they schedule them. If this video made you uncomfortable, that's the point. Because the real danger isn't monsters, it's systems that fail quietly while everyone looks busy. These cases remind us that silence, excuses, and delay can be just as deadly as violence itself. If you want more deep, unsettling stories that actually make you think, like, and subscribe.